The dust from her father's boots had barely settled in the cemetery before Natalie Owens learned she was nothing more than a debt to be collected. She stood in the cramped parlor of the only home she had ever known, her black mourning dress feeling like a shroud in the oppressive August heat of 1881, and listened as Mr. Harrington, the banker, explained in crisp, emotionless terms that her father had borrowed extensively against the ranch. The numbers he recited meant nothing to her. What cut through the fog of grief was his final pronouncement that Vernon Blackthorne, the wealthiest landowner in Gold Hill, Nevada, had purchased the debt and expected payment in full or the forfeiture of the property within 30 days. "There is, however, an alternative arrangement," Mr. Harrington said, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Blackthorne has expressed his willingness to forgive the entire debt in exchange for your hand in marriage." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had met Vernon Blackthorne exactly twice in her 22 years, both times at church socials, and both encounters had left her skin crawling. He was a man in his late 40s with cold, calculating eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness that extended far beyond his business dealings. The whispers about his first wife, who had died under mysterious circumstances 5 years prior, were never spoken above a murmur, but everyone in Gold Hill knew enough to fear him. "I need time to consider," Natalie managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have until September 15th, Mr. Harrington said, snapping his ledger closed. "Mr. Blackthorne expects an answer by then." When the banker left, Natalie sank into her father's worn leather chair and let the tears come. Her father, Thomas Owens, had been a dreamer, always certain the next cattle drive or the next season would bring prosperity. Instead, he had brought her to this impossible choice: lose everything or bind herself to a man she instinctively knew would destroy her. She spent the next week trying to find alternatives. She visited every business owner in Gold Hill, asking about employment. The responses ranged from pitying refusals to outright laughter. A woman alone, especially one of her age and station, had limited options, and none of them would earn enough to satisfy a debt of $3,000. By the second week, Vernon Blackthorne began calling on her personally. He arrived each afternoon in his polished carriage, always impeccably dressed, always bearing some expensive gift she did not want. He spoke to her as if the arrangement were already settled, discussing plans for expanding his holdings and how she would serve as hostess for his business associates. "You will find me a generous husband," he told her on his 5th visit, his pale eyes sliding over her in a way that made her stomach turn. "I expect obedience and discretion. In return, you will want for nothing material except freedom, safety, the right to her own thoughts." Natalie nodded mutely, counting the minutes until he would leave. It was on a Thursday afternoon, with only 1 week remaining until her deadline, that Preston Pike rode into Gold Hill for the first time in 3 years. Preston had left Nevada as a restless 19-year-old, desperate to escape the suffocating expectations of his father's mercantile business. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, served briefly as a deputy in a Colorado mining town, and learned that the freedom he sought came with its own brand of loneliness. When word reached him in Wyoming that his father had suffered a stroke, Preston rode south without hesitation, arriving in Gold Hill with trail dust on his clothes and 3 years of living etched into the lines around his eyes. His father, Marcus Pike, lay propped up in bed above the mercantile, his left side paralyzed and his speech slurred but his mind still sharp. Preston's mother had died when he was young, and his only sister had married and moved to San Francisco years ago, leaving Marcus alone to run the business that had been the Pike family's livelihood for 2 generations. "The store," Marcus managed, his words thick and difficult. "Need you." "I am here," Preston assured him, clasping his father's working hand. "I will handle everything." The mercantile had suffered in Marcus's illness. Inventory was low, accounts were in disarray, and customers had begun taking their business to the larger establishments that had opened in Virginia City. Preston threw himself into the work, rising before dawn and staying late into the night, slowly bringing order back to chaos. It was during one of these late evenings, as he was checking inventory in the storeroom, that he overheard 2 women talking in the front of the store. "It is a tragedy," one woman said. "That sweet Natalie Owens forced to marry that terrible man." "She has no choice," the other replied. "Not with the debt her father left. Vernon Blackthorne owns half the county already. Now he will own her too." Preston felt something tighten in his chest at the name, Natalie Owens. He remembered her from before he left, though she would have been just 19 then. He had a vague recollection of a quiet girl with serious dark eyes who used to come into the mercantile with her father. She had always been kind, he recalled, once helping his father find a book that had been misshelved without being asked. He stepped out from the storeroom. "Excuse me, ladies." I could not help overhearing. "Are you speaking of Thomas Owens's daughter?" The 2 women turned, both middle-aged wives of local shopkeepers. The taller one nodded. "Poor girl. Her father died last month and Vernon Blackthorne holds the debt on their ranch. He has given her an ultimatum, marry him or lose everything." "When?" Preston asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "The deadline is September 15th, 6 days from now." After the women left, Preston stood alone in the dim store, his mind racing. He knew Vernon Blackthorne by reputation. Everyone in the territory did. The man was a bully who used his wealth as a weapon, crushing anyone who stood in his way. The thought of any woman being forced into marriage with him, let alone someone as genuinely decent as Natalie Owens, stirred something fierce and protective in Preston's gut. He told himself it was not his concern. He had his own responsibilities now, his father to care for and a business to rebuild. Getting involved in someone else's troubles, especially troubles involving a man as powerful as Blackthorne, was foolish at best and dangerous at worst. But that night, lying in his childhood bed in the room above the mercantile, Preston could not sleep. He kept thinking about what the woman had said. That sweet Natalie Owens, forced to marry that terrible man. The injustice of it gnawed at him, and by the time the sun rose, he had made a decision that defied all logic. He waited until his father was awake and had eaten breakfast, then sat beside his bed. "I need to tell you something," Preston said. "I am going to help Natalie Owens." His father's good eye studied him carefully. "How?" "I am going to pay her father's debt." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. 3,000, he finally said, the words coming slowly. "That is everything, the store." "I know." Preston had spent half the night going through the books. The mercantile had approximately $3,000 in assets if he sold everything and liquidated all the inventory. It would leave them with nothing, but his father would still have the building and Preston could find work to support them. "Why?" Marcus asked. Preston was not entirely sure himself. "Because no one should be forced into a marriage like that. Because I can help, so I should." His father's face softened, something like pride flickering in his eyes. "Your mother," he said with effort, "would be proud." But when Preston rode out to the Owens ranch that afternoon to speak with Natalie, he found the situation more complicated than simple charity. She answered the door in a faded calico dress, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and he was struck by how much more beautiful she had become in the 3 years since he had last seen her. There was a wariness in her expression, though, a guardedness he understood immediately. "Miss Owens," he said, removing his hat. "My name is Preston Pike. I do not know if you remember me." "I remember." Her voice was soft but steady. "Your father owned the mercantile. He still does. I returned recently because he is ill." Preston shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. "I heard about your situation. The debt, Blackthorne." Her face closed off completely. "If you have come to gawk or offer pity, I would prefer you leave." "I have come to offer help." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I can pay the debt, $3,000. You would be free of the obligation." Natalie stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped back from the door. "You should come inside." The ranch house was small but tidy, every surface clean despite the obvious wear of age and poverty. Natalie gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table, but she remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You do not know me." "Because it is wrong," Preston said simply. "What Blackthorne is doing. No one should be bought like property." "And what would you want in return?" The bitterness in her tone cut him. "Because men like Vernon Blackthorne have taught me that no one offers something for nothing." Preston felt anger rise in his chest, not at her but at the situation that had taught her such cynicism. "I want nothing except to see you free of him." "I do not believe you." She turned to the window, her shoulders rigid. "Even if I did, I cannot accept." "Charity is still a form of debt, Mr. Pike. I would simply be trading one obligation for another." He stood, frustrated. "It would not be charity. It would be—" He stopped, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if it were an investment? She turned back to him, frowning. "What do you mean, this ranch? It has good grazing land, water rights. If someone put money into it, built up the herd, it could be profitable." The plan was taking shape even as he spoke. "I pay the debt, we become business partners. You run the ranch, I provide capital and help with the work. We split the profits." Natalie studied him with those serious dark eyes. "You would trust me as a business partner?" "Yes. Even though I know nothing about running a ranch on my own. Even though I am a woman and half this town thinks women are not capable of managing property. My mother ran our mercantile for 10 years while my father was away during the war," Preston said. "She was better at it than he ever was. So yes, I would trust you." For the first time, something softened in Natalie's expression. "That would still leave you vulnerable. If I failed, you would lose everything." "Then we would both be poor together," Preston said with a slight smile. "I have been poor before. It is not the worst thing." She was quiet for a long time, and he could see her mind working, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, she said, "There is another problem. Even if you pay the debt, Vernon Blackthorne will not simply accept it. He wants me, not just the money. He will find another way to force the issue." Preston felt his jaw tighten. "Then we make it impossible for him." "How?" The words were out before he could fully consider them. "Marry me instead." Natalie's eyes went wide. "What?" "Think about it," Preston said, his mind racing now. "If you are married to someone else, Blackthorne has no claim. The debt is paid and you are legally protected." "That is insane," Natalie said, but he could hear the thread of hope in her voice. "You cannot just marry a stranger to solve her problems." "Why not?" Preston moved closer, keeping his voice calm and reasonable. "It would be a practical arrangement. We are already discussing a business partnership. This would simply make it legal. We could have separate rooms, separate lives. It would be a marriage in name only, just to keep you safe." "And what do you get from this arrangement?" Natalie asked. "Besides a wife who does not love you and a ranch that might fail," Preston met her eyes steadily. I get to know that I did the right thing, that I helped someone who needed it. Is that not enough?" She turned away again, her hand pressed to her mouth. He could see her trembling slightly and realized how overwhelming this must be. He had dropped into her life like a storm, offering solutions that seemed too good to be real, and she had every reason to be suspicious. "I need time to think," she finally said. "You have 6 days until Blackthorne's deadline," Preston reminded her gently. "But I understand. This is your decision to make." He left her then, riding back to town with his heart pounding. He had just proposed marriage to a woman he barely knew, offering to risk everything on a plan that had more holes than a moth-eaten blanket. His father would say he had lost his mind. Preston was starting to think he might be right. But when he closed his eyes, he kept seeing Natalie's face, the fear and desperation she was trying so hard to hide. He had spent 3 years drifting, looking for something that mattered. Maybe this was it. The next day, Natalie appeared at the mercantile just before closing. Preston was sweeping the floor when the bell above the door chimed. She looked determined but nervous, her hands clutched tightly around her reticule. "I have thought about your offer," she said without preamble. "All of it." Preston set the broom aside, his heart suddenly beating faster. "And I have conditions." She squared her shoulders. "If we do this, I need your word that you will not expect anything from me beyond what we agree to right now. No marital rights unless I freely choose them. Separate rooms. My decisions about the ranch must be respected." "Agreed," Preston said immediately. "And if, after a reasonable time, we find this arrangement is not working, we should be able to end it. Quietly, without scandal if possible, but ended nonetheless." That one stung a bit, but he understood her need for an escape route. "Agreed." Natalie took a deep breath. "Then yes, Mr. Pike, I will marry you." The relief that flooded through him was so intense it surprised him. "Preston," he said, "if we are going to be married, you should call me Preston." "Preston," she repeated, testing the name, "and you should call me Natalie." They stood there for a moment, two strangers who had just agreed to bind their lives together, and Preston felt the weight of what they were doing settle over him. This was not some romantic story from a dime novel. This was real, with real consequences, and he had just taken responsibility for another person's entire future. "We should do this quickly," Natalie said, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Before Vernon learns what we are planning. He has people who report to him all over town." "Tomorrow," Preston agreed. "I will speak to Reverend Matthews tonight and arrange everything. We can marry at the church in the morning, then I will go directly to the bank with the payment." "He will be furious," Natalie said quietly. "Vernon does not like to lose." "Let him be furious," Preston said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "He does not own you, Natalie. No one does." For the first time since he had met her again, she smiled. It was small and tentative, but genuine. "Thank you, Preston. I know this is strange and probably foolish, but thank you." After she left, Preston stood in the empty mercantile and wondered what he had set in motion. Then he went upstairs to tell his father he was getting married in the morning. Marcus took the news with surprising calm. "Love her?" he asked bluntly. "I barely know her," Preston admitted, "but I respect her. That is a start." His father nodded slowly. "More than many have." He struggled with his words, then managed, "Marry for the right reasons. Love can grow." Preston hoped he was right. The next morning dawned clear and hot. The September sun already fierce by the time Preston arrived at the small, whitewashed church at the edge of Gold Hill. He wore his best clothes, which were not particularly fine, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked on the ride over. Natalie was already there, standing in the shade of the church's overhang. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the darkness of her eyes, and her hair was arranged in soft waves around her face. She looked beautiful and terrified. "Ready?" Preston asked, offering her the flowers. She took them with shaking hands. "I think so. Are you?" "No," he said honestly, "but I am going to do it anyway." That surprised a small laugh out of her, and some of the tension eased from her shoulders. Reverend Matthews was waiting inside along with his wife to serve as witness. The ceremony was brief and simple, the words both ancient and binding. Preston slid a plain gold band onto Natalie's finger, one that had belonged to his mother. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Preston leaned in for the expected kiss, keeping it chaste and quick. Natalie's lips were soft and she smelled like lavender. They signed the marriage certificate. Mrs. Matthews dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and just like that, Preston Pike was a married man. "I will go to the bank now," Preston said as they stepped back into the blazing sunshine. "Do you want to come with me?" Natalie shook her head. "I cannot face that place again. I will wait at the Mercantile if that is acceptable. Of course, my father will be happy for the company." He watched her walk away, his wife of less than an hour, and felt the surreal nature of the situation wash over him again. Then he straightened his shoulders and headed for the bank. Mr. Harrington looked up from his desk with barely concealed surprise when Preston walked in. "Mr. Pike." "How can I help you?" "I am here to settle the debt of Thomas Owens," Preston said, placing a bank draft on the desk. $3,000 paid in full. The banker's eyebrows rose. "I see, and you are acting on Miss Owens's behalf," "Mrs. Pike's behalf," Preston corrected. "We were married this morning." Harrington's face went through several interesting contortions. "Mrs. Pike," he repeated slowly, "I was not aware you and Miss Owens were courting. We kept it private." Preston kept his voice level and calm. "Now, if you could provide a receipt showing the debt is satisfied, I have other business to attend to." The banker fumbled with his papers, clearly trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "Mr. Blackthorne will need to be informed. He had an arrangement with Miss Owens." "Miss Owens no longer exists," Preston said coldly. "And Mrs. Pike has no arrangements with Vernon Blackthorne. Just process the payment, Mr. Harrington." It took another 20 minutes of paperwork, but finally, Preston walked out of the bank with legal documentation that Natalie's debt was satisfied, and the ranch belonged to her free and clear. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least she was safe from being sold like property to pay her father's mistakes. He was halfway back to the Mercantile when a voice called out behind him. "Pike!" Preston turned to see Vernon Blackthorne striding toward him, his face mottled with rage. The older man was impressively dressed as always, but there was nothing refined about the fury in his eyes. "You," Blackthorne snarled. "What have you done?" "I paid a debt," Preston said calmly. "That is all. You married her." Blackthorne moved closer, invading Preston's space. "You married Natalie Owens." "I married my wife," Preston corrected, "and you need to step back." "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with?" Blackthorne's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I own this town. I can destroy you with a word." Preston felt his own anger rising but kept it in check. "Then I guess you better decide if I am worth the effort. Because the debt is paid, the marriage is legal, and there is nothing you can do about it." "There is always something I can do," Blackthorne said. "You have made an enemy today, Pike. You will regret it." He turned and strode away, his shoulders rigid with rage. Preston watched him go and felt a chill despite the heat. He had known this would not be simple, but seeing the naked hatred in Blackthorne's face drove home just how dangerous this situation might become. When he returned to the Mercantile, he found Natalie sitting with his father, reading aloud from a newspaper. She looked up when he entered, her expression anxious. "It is done," Preston said, showing her the papers. "You are free. The ranch is yours." The relief that flooded her face made everything worth it. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Preston." Marcus made a gesture with his good hand. "Family now," he managed, and that simply it was decided. Natalie was part of the Pike family, for better or worse. They spent the rest of the day making practical arrangements. Natalie would move into the small house behind the mercantile temporarily while they figured out the living situation. Preston would continue helping his father with the store during the day and spend evenings and early mornings working on the ranch. It would be exhausting, but it was manageable. That evening, as Preston helped Natalie carry her few belongings into the little house, they moved around each other with careful politeness. He showed her the bedroom, a simple room with a brass bed and a faded quilt. "I will sleep on the couch in the front room," Preston said. "You take the bedroom, are you sure?" Natalie asked. "This is your house." "You are my wife," Preston said. "That makes it your house too." She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "You are not at all what I expected, Preston Pike." "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone who would expect gratitude, I suppose. Someone who would remind me constantly that I owed him." "You do not owe me anything," Preston said firmly. "We are partners, remember? We help each other." That night, lying on the uncomfortable couch with his feet hanging off the end, Preston listened to the sounds of Natalie moving around in the bedroom and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He had been married for exactly 12 hours to a woman he barely knew and had made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in Nevada. It should have terrified him. Instead, he felt more certain of his path than he had in years. The next days fell into a rhythm. Preston woke before dawn and rode out to the Owens ranch, working on repairs and checking the small herd that remained. Natalie joined him when she could, and he was impressed by how much she actually knew about ranching. Her father might have been a poor businessman, but he had taught her the practical skills. They worked side by side, mending fences and moving cattle to better grazing, and Preston found himself enjoying her company. She had a quiet sense of humor that emerged once she felt more comfortable, and she was not afraid of hard work. More than once, he caught himself watching her as she worked, admiring the competent way she handled herself. At midday, Preston would ride back to town to help at the mercantile, where his father was slowly regaining some strength and mobility. Marcus had taken to Natalie immediately, and Preston often returned in the evening to find them engaged in games of checkers or discussing the novels Natalie loved to read. In the evenings, Preston and Natalie would have dinner together in the small house, talking about their plans for the ranch and the repairs that needed attention. They were careful with each other still, maintaining a polite distance, but Preston could feel something shifting between them. The wariness in Natalie's eyes was fading, replaced by something warmer. It was 2 weeks after their wedding when Vernon Blackthorne made his next move. Preston arrived at the ranch one morning to find half the fencing along the eastern pasture cut and 20 head of cattle missing. His blood ran cold. This was not random theft. This was a message. He rode immediately back to town and reported the incident to Sheriff Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 50s who listened with a carefully neutral expression. "You have any idea who might have done this?" Morrison asked. "I have suspicions," Preston said carefully, "but no proof." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Vernon Blackthorne came to see me yesterday, said you had interfered in his business dealings, said you might try to make false accusations against him." Preston felt anger surge through him. "So you are not going to investigate?" "I did not say that," Morrison replied. "I will look into it. But you should know that going against Blackthorne is not a smart move in this town, Pike. He has a long reach." Preston left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated and helpless. He knew exactly who was behind the cattle theft, but without proof, there was nothing he could do. And Blackthorne would know that. When he told Natalie what had happened, she went pale. "This is my fault," she said. "He is punishing you because of me." "He is a bully picking a fight," Preston corrected. "But we are not going to let him win." They increased security at the ranch, with Preston sleeping in the barn several nights a week to watch for trouble. It made him exhausted, trying to maintain both the ranch and the mercantile, but he refused to give Blackthorne the satisfaction of seeing him quit. Then things escalated. Preston was working late at the mercantile one evening when two men he did not recognize walked in just before closing. They were rough-looking characters, clearly not local, and they made no pretense of shopping. "You Preston Pike?" the taller one asked. "Who is asking?" Preston replied, his hand moving subtly toward the rifle he kept under the counter. "We have a message from Mr. Blackthorne," the man said. "He wants you to know that accidents happen. Stores burn down. People get hurt, especially when they do not know their place." Before Preston could respond, the man swept his arm across the nearest shelf, sending merchandise crashing to the floor. His companion laughed and kicked over a barrel of nails. "You deliver that message to your boss," Preston said, his voice deadly calm. "Tell him if he wants to threaten me, he should have the courage to do it himself." The two men exchanged glances, then walked out laughing. Preston stood there, shaking with rage, and surveyed the damage. It was not extensive, but the threat was clear. When he told Natalie, she immediately said, "We should leave. Pack up and go somewhere else. California, maybe, or Oregon." "I am not running," Preston said. "This is our home. Our business. I will not let him chase us away." "Then what do we do?" Natalie asked, her voice breaking. "Wait until he really does burn down the store. Wait until someone gets killed." Preston had no answer. He was beginning to realize that he had underestimated Vernon Blackthorne, had thought him simply a bully who would back down when confronted. Instead, the man was escalating, pushing harder, and Preston was not sure how to stop it without violence. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about Natalie's frightened face, about his father lying helpless upstairs, about the fragile life they were trying to build. He had promised to protect her, but how could he do that against someone with Blackthorne's resources and ruthlessness? The answer came from an unexpected source. The next afternoon, an older rancher named Jack Thornton came into the mercantile. Preston knew him slightly, a respected man with a spread north of town. "Heard you are having trouble with Blackthorne," Thornton said without preamble. Preston nodded cautiously. "Word travels fast. It always does when Vernon is involved." Thornton leaned against the counter. "He tried to force me out 5 years ago after my wife died, wanted my water rights, started cutting fences, running off cattle, the same games he is playing with you." "What did you do?" Preston asked. "I got smart," Thornton said. "See, men like Blackthorne, they rely on people being afraid to stand up to them, but if enough people band together, they lose that power." He pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "There are 12 ranchers and business owners in this area who Blackthorne has threatened or cheated over the years. We have all signed this petition demanding the territorial governor investigate his business practices. We have documented every incident, every shady deal. We just needed one more person willing to add their testimony." Preston stared at the paper. "You want me to testify against him?" "I want you to help us bring him down legally," Thornton corrected. "With enough evidence and enough voices, even Vernon Blackthorne cannot hide behind his money and influence." It was risky. Testifying would make Preston an even bigger target, but it was also a real solution, a way to fight back without resorting to violence. "Where do I sign?" Preston asked. Over the next week, Preston met secretly with the other ranchers and businessmen who had been victimized by Blackthorne. The list of crimes was extensive: intimidation, theft, fraud, even suspected arson. Together, they compiled a case that was impossible to ignore. When the petition was submitted to the territorial governor, Blackthorne reacted with predictable rage. He stormed through Gold Hill, making threats and accusations. But this time, he could not silence his opponents because there were too many of them, all standing together. The governor sent an investigator, a no-nonsense federal marshal named Elias Grant, who spent 2 weeks in Gold Hill interviewing witnesses and examining records. Preston testified about the cattle theft and the threats to his store. Natalie testified about Blackthorne's attempt to coerce her into marriage. Others came forward with stories that painted a damning picture. When Marshal Grant finally issued his report, it recommended criminal charges against Vernon Blackthorne for multiple counts of fraud, intimidation, and theft. Blackthorne was arrested on a cold October morning, taken from his grand house in handcuffs while half the town watched. Preston stood with Natalie in the crowd, her hand gripping his tightly. "Is it really over?" she whispered. "It is really over," Preston confirmed. At the trial 2 months later, Vernon Blackthorne was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison. His assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims. The Owens Ranch received a settlement that more than covered the original debt, plus damages. Standing on the courthouse steps after the verdict, Natalie turned to Preston. "We could use that money to dissolve our marriage," she said quietly. "Give you back what you spent. Let you move on with your life." Preston looked at her, this woman who had become so much more than a stranger he had helped. Over the past months, he had fallen in love with her quiet strength, her sharp mind, her dry humor. He loved the way she sang while cooking, the way she could gentle a spooked horse, the way she challenged him when she thought he was wrong. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his heart in his throat. Natalie met his eyes. "No," she said softly. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life, Preston. This marriage might have started as an arrangement, but it has become something real for me, if you feel the same way." Relief and joy flooded through him. "I fell in love with you sometime between fixing fences and playing checkers with my father," Preston admitted. "I did not plan to. I thought I was just helping someone in need. But you became everything to me, Natalie." "Then perhaps we should start our marriage over," Natalie said, smiling. "The right way this time." Preston leaned down and kissed her properly, there on the courthouse steps with half of Gold Hill watching. When they broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "Take me home, husband," Natalie said. "Which home?" Preston asked. "The house in town or the ranch?" "Let us go to the ranch," Natalie decided. "It is ours, truly ours now. We should build our life there." They rode out to the ranch that afternoon, and for the first time, Preston did not leave at sunset. That night, Natalie came to him without fear or obligation, and they consummated their marriage as they should have done months ago, with love and joy and hope for the future. The next year was a revelation for both of them. They sold the mercantile to a young couple moving west, using the money to expand the ranch. Marcus moved out to the ranch house with them, his health slowly improving in the clean air and open spaces. He took charge of the kitchen garden and the chickens, happy to contribute even in small ways. Preston and Natalie worked the ranch together, building it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavier work, young men who were grateful for steady employment, and treated Natalie with the respect she deserved. In the spring of 1883, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. Preston was terrified and elated in equal measure. They converted one of the ranch house's rooms into a nursery, painting it yellow because they did not know if they were having a boy or girl. Their son was born on a warm September morning, squalling and red-faced and perfect. They named him Thomas, after Natalie's father, and Marcus wept when they told him. Preston held his son for the first time and felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of love and responsibility. This tiny person depended on him completely. It was terrifying and wonderful. "You are going to be an amazing father," Natalie told him, watching from the bed with exhausted eyes. "I am going to try," Preston promised. Thomas turned out to be a healthy, happy baby with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Marcus doted on his grandson, and the ranch house was filled with laughter and chaos in the best possible way. When Thomas was 2 years old, Natalie became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, who had Preston's lighter coloring and Natalie's serious expression. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. The ranch prospered, their children grew, and Preston and Natalie's love deepened with each season. They had their struggles, of course. There were droughts and hard winters, sick cattle and broken equipment. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. Marcus lived to see his grandchildren grow into smart, capable young people. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by the family he loved. They buried him in the Gold Hill Cemetery, next to Preston's mother, and Preston felt grateful that his father had lived to see him so happy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston and Natalie stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas, now 9, was teaching his 7-year-old sister how to rope a fence post, both of them laughing at their failures. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" Natalie asked, leaning against Preston's shoulder. "Sometimes," Preston admitted. "I think about that night I heard those women talking in the store. What would have happened if I had not listened, if I had not decided to help?" "I would probably be dead," Natalie said matter-of-factly, "or wishing I was. Vernon Blackthorne would have destroyed me." Preston wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "I cannot imagine my life without you, without all of this." "You rode all night to save me," Natalie said softly. "That is what you told me once when we were courting properly. You said that when you heard about the deadline you could not sleep, could not rest until you had figured out a way to help. You rode through your thoughts all night searching for a solution. And I found you," Preston said, kissing the top of her head. "The best thing that ever happened to me." "We found each other," Natalie corrected. "I was so scared when you first proposed this arrangement. But you gave me something I had never had before, the freedom to choose. You offered me your name and your protection and asked nothing in return. How could I not fall in love with you?" "I fell in love with your strength," Preston said. "The way you refused to be broken, even when everything seemed hopeless. The way you laughed even when you were terrified. The way you trusted me, even though you had every reason not to." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children play and the sun sink toward the horizon. In the distance, cattle grazed on land that was truly theirs, bought with hard work and sacrifice and love. "You think they will understand someday?" Natalie asked. "Thomas and Emma. Do you think they will understand how precious this is, what we built for them?" "I hope so," Preston said. "But even if they do not, we will know. We will remember what it took to get here." That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Preston and Natalie sat together in the front room, her head resting on his shoulder while he read aloud from one of her favorite novels. It was a simple moment, ordinary in every way, but Preston treasured it. These were the moments that made up a life, he had learned. Not the grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but the quiet evenings spent together, the shared laughter, the comfort of knowing someone truly understood you. Preston. Natalie said suddenly. Yes, thank you for choosing me, for seeing me as worth saving. Preston set down the book and turned to face her fully. You were always worth saving, Natalie, always. I just got lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of the love they had built together over 10 years. When they broke apart, she was smiling. Take me to bed, husband, she said, echoing the words she had spoken on the courthouse steps so many years ago. With pleasure, wife, Preston replied, and meant it with his whole heart. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Thomas grew into a young man who shared his father's sense of justice and his mother's practical wisdom. He took to ranching naturally, working alongside Preston from the time he was old enough to sit a horse. Emma, meanwhile, developed a fierce love of learning that reminded Preston of his own mother. She read everything she could get her hands on and announced at age 12 that she intended to become a teacher. Natalie and Preston encouraged her dreams, even as they worried about the challenges a woman would face in that profession. In 1893, when Preston was 34 and Natalie 33, they welcomed a third child, another son they named Marcus after Preston's father. This baby was a surprise, born 10 years after Emma, but no less loved for being unexpected. Thomas and Emma doted on their baby brother, and the ranch house once again filled with the sounds of a young child. The ranch itself had grown substantially. They now ran 500 head of cattle and had acquired additional grazing land. Preston and Natalie had become respected members of the community, known for their fairness and integrity. When there were disputes between neighbors, people often came to them to mediate. When families fell on hard times, Preston and Natalie were the first to offer help, remembering their own desperate beginning. One evening in the summer of 1895, Preston was teaching 12-year-old Marcus to rope when a rider approached from town. It was Sheriff Morrison, now gray-haired and nearing retirement, with news that made Preston's blood run cold. Vernon Blackthorne had been released from prison after serving his full sentence. He had been seen in Virginia City, asking questions about Gold Hill and specifically about the Pike family. That night, after the children were asleep, Preston and Natalie sat at the kitchen table and discussed what this meant. "He is not going to let it go," Natalie said quietly. "After 12 years, he is still bitter about what we did." "He cannot hurt us," Preston said, but he was not as certain as he wanted to be. "We have the law on our side. We have friends. He is just one man now with no money and no power." "Desperate men are dangerous," Natalie observed. "Maybe we should send the children away for a while." "To San Francisco, to your sister." Preston considered this. His sister Jane had married well and lived in a fine house in San Francisco. She had offered many times to host her nieces and nephews. "Thomas would not go," he said. "He is 16. He would insist on staying to help defend the ranch." "Then we send Emma and Marcus," Natalie decided. "At least they will be safe." They made the arrangements the next day. Emma was disappointed to miss the summer on the ranch, but she understood the seriousness when her parents explained. Young Marcus was thrilled at the prospect of seeing the big city and did not fully grasp the danger. Preston and Natalie took the children to Virginia City and saw them safely on the train west, with detailed letters to Jane explaining the situation. When the train pulled away, Natalie cried and Preston held her tightly. "They will be fine," he murmured. "Jane will take good care of them. This is just a precaution." "I know," Natalie said, wiping her eyes. "But I hate that he can still frighten us, that he can still disrupt our lives after all this time." They returned to the ranch to find Thomas waiting anxiously. At 16, he was already taller than his father, with broad shoulders from hard work and his mother's steady dark eyes. "Are they gone?" he asked. "On their way to San Francisco," Preston confirmed. "Now we need to talk about what happens next." They spent the evening making plans. Thomas would stick close to the ranch house, never working alone in the far pastures. They would take turns keeping watch at night. Preston sent word to their ranch hands and to Jack Thornton and the other neighboring ranchers, asking them to report any sign of Blackthorne in the area. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Preston started to hope that perhaps Blackthorne had simply been passing through Virginia City, that their precautions were unnecessary. Then, on a hot August night, Thomas woke Preston and Natalie with urgent whispers. "Someone is trying to open the barn," he said. "I heard noises. I think it is more than one person." Preston was out of bed instantly, grabbing his rifle. "Stay with your mother," he told Thomas. "I am coming with you," Thomas said stubbornly. "Thomas," Natalie started. "I am not a child," Thomas interrupted. "This is my home too. I am coming." Preston looked at his son, seeing the determination in his young face, and made a decision. "Get your rifle. Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say." They moved through the dark house and out the back door, circling around toward the barn. In the moonlight, Preston could see 3 figures near the barn door, and the smell of kerosene was sharp in the air. They were planning to burn it down. "That is far enough," Preston called out, raising his rifle. "Step away from the barn." The 3 men whirled. Preston recognized Vernon Blackthorne, older and harder looking than before, with 2 rough companions flanking him. "Preston Pike," Blackthorne said, his voice dripping with venom. "Still playing the hero, still protecting what is mine," Preston replied. "You need to leave, Blackthorne. Now. Before this gets worse." "Worse?" Blackthorne laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my life. You took everything from me. You think I am going to just walk away. You destroyed your own life," Preston said. "We just made sure you faced the consequences. Leave now and I will let you go." "Stay, and I will have the sheriff here within the hour." "The same sheriff who did nothing when I needed help," Blackthorne sneered. "I do not think so." He nodded to his companions, who began advancing toward Preston and Thomas. Preston fired a warning shot into the air. "The next one will not be a warning." Behind him, he heard more footsteps and turned to see Natalie emerging from the house with a shotgun. Then, to his amazement, riders appeared from the direction of the road. Jack Thornton and several other neighboring ranchers, all armed. "We saw the lights and figures moving around," Thornton called out. "Thought you might need help." Blackthorne looked at the assembled group, and for the first time seemed to understand that he was outnumbered and outmatched. His face twisted with rage and something like despair. "This is not over," he snarled. "Yes, it is," Preston said firmly. "It ends tonight, Vernon. You can ride away now and try to build a new life somewhere else, or you can force us to involve the law again. Your choice." For a long moment, Blackthorne stood frozen, clearly torn between his desire for revenge and self-preservation. Finally, with a curse, he turned and stalked toward the horses tied at the fence line. His 2 companions followed quickly. They watched in silence as Blackthorne and his men rode away into the darkness. Preston did not lower his rifle until they were out of sight. "Thank you," he said to Thornton and the others. "We owe you." "You have done the same for any of us," Thornton replied. "That is what neighbors do." After the other ranchers left, Preston, Natalie, and Thomas stood together in the moonlit yard, the smell of kerosene still lingering in the air. "You think he will really leave?" Thomas asked. "I think he does not have any other choice," Preston said. "He is a man with nothing left to lose except his freedom. He will not risk prison again." Preston was right. They never saw Vernon Blackthorne again. Word filtered back eventually that he had died 2 years later in a boarding house in Sacramento, alone and broke. Preston felt a strange mixture of pity and relief when he heard the news. The ghost that had haunted them was finally laid to rest. Emma and Marcus returned from San Francisco a month after the confrontation, full of stories about cable cars and the ocean. Emma announced that she had decided to attend teachers' college in California, though she promised to come home during the summers. Young Marcus was content to be back on the ranch, declaring that the city was interesting but far too crowded. Life returned to its normal rhythms. Thomas took on more responsibility, eventually becoming his father's full partner in running the ranch. Emma did become a teacher, returning to Gold Hill and opening a school that welcomed children from all the surrounding ranches. She married a quiet geologist named Samuel, who had come west to study the Nevada rock formations, and they built a small house in town. Marcus, the baby of the family, grew up to be a gentle soul who loved animals. He had a gift for veterinary work and apprenticed with the town's animal doctor, eventually taking over the practice. Preston and Natalie grew older together, their hair graying and their faces weathering, but their love never diminishing. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Preston stood on the porch with his wife. Surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Thomas had married and had 2 daughters of his own and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. 25 years ago, I rode into town with no idea my life was about to change completely, Preston said, raising a glass. I thought I was coming home to help my father with the store. Instead, I found a woman in trouble and I made a reckless decision that by all logic should have ended in disaster. It did nearly end in disaster several times, Natalie interjected with a smile, making everyone laugh. True, Preston acknowledged, but we survived. We more than survived. We built this life, this family, this home, and I would not change a single moment of it. Even the part where you slept on that horrible couch for 3 months, Natalie teased. Even that, Preston confirmed, because every uncomfortable night was worth it to wake up knowing you were safe. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands. You were promised to a cruel man, and I offered you freedom and my name, but you gave me so much more in return. You gave me purpose and partnership and a love I never expected to find. You made me a better man, Natalie. You were always a good man, Natalie said, her eyes bright with tears. You just needed someone to see it. Their children applauded, and their grandchildren demanded cake, and the evening dissolved into laughter and music and joy. Later, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Preston and Natalie sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars wheel overhead. "You remember that night I proposed?" Preston asked. "In your kitchen, with that crazy plan about business partnerships." "I thought you had lost your mind," Natalie admitted. "A stranger offering to solve all my problems. It seemed too good to be true. But you said yes anyway." "Because I looked in your eyes and saw something genuine," Natalie said. "I saw someone who actually cared about what happened to me. Not because he wanted something from me, but because it was the right thing to do. How could I not take that chance?" "Best decision you ever made," Preston said with a grin. Natalie elbowed him gently. "Best decision we both made." They sat in comfortable silence, the way couples do when they have spent decades together and do not need words to communicate. Preston thought about the boy he had been at 19. Restless and searching for meaning. He thought about the man he had become at 22, riding into Gold Hill with no idea he was about to meet his destiny. He thought about all the choices and chances that had led to this moment, this life, this love. "I would do it all again," he said suddenly. Natalie turned to look at him. Do what again? Everything. If I could go back to that moment in the store, hearing those women talk about you being forced to marry Blackthorne, I would make the same choice. I would offer you the same deal. I would take the same risks, because it all led here to you, to this life we have built. You sweet man, Natalie murmured, kissing his weathered cheek. I love you, Preston Pike, more today than yesterday, more tomorrow than today. Is that a promise? Preston asked, echoing the words from their wedding vows all those years ago. It is a promise, Natalie confirmed. Forever. The years continued their steady march. Preston and Natalie celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th. They became grandparents several times over, their house always full of visiting family. Thomas ran the ranch with quiet competence, while Emma's school thrived, educating a new generation of Nevada children. Marcus became known throughout the territory for his skill with animals, and people traveled from miles away to consult with him. On a crisp October morning in 1911, Preston and Natalie sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Preston was 72 now, Natalie 71, and they moved more slowly than they once had. But their minds were sharp, and their love was as strong as ever. I have been thinking, Natalie said, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, about writing it all down, our story, for the grandchildren and their children after them. Our story, Preston smiled. The scandalous tale of how I married a woman I barely knew to save her from a villain. The beautiful tale of how you saw someone in need and helped without expectation of reward, Natalie corrected. How we built a partnership that became a marriage that became a love story. I think future generations should know that good people exist, that sometimes heroes really do ride to the rescue. I was never a hero, Preston protested. I just did what needed doing. That is exactly what makes you a hero, Natalie said softly. You saw injustice and you acted. You risked everything to help someone you barely knew. You taught our children that character matters more than money, that standing up for what is right is always worth it, even when it is hard. Preston reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. If you write it down, make sure you include the part where I fell in love with you while we were mending fences. That was when I knew for certain that this marriage was going to be real. I thought you fell in love with me during checkers games with your father. That was when I started falling, Preston clarified. The fence mending was when I tumbled completely over the edge. Natalie laughed, the sound as bright and clear as it had been when she was young. I will include everything, the good and the bad, the fear and the joy. The way we started with nothing but hope and built this incredible life. Do not forget to mention how beautiful you looked on our wedding day, Preston added. In that blue dress holding those wildflowers, I thought my heart would stop. Flatterer, Natalie accused fondly. Truth-teller, Preston countered. They sat together watching the sun rise over land they had loved and worked for 30 years, surrounded by the legacy of their unlikely union. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild on the way. A ranch that thrived and employed good people. A community made better by their presence. A love story that had started with desperation and heroism and had grown into something deep and enduring. Thank you, Natalie said suddenly. For what? For riding all night, metaphorically speaking, to offer me freedom in your name. For seeing me as worthy of saving. For loving me even when I was prickly and suspicious. For building this life with me. Preston lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently. Thank you for trusting me, for taking a chance on a crazy plan proposed by an almost stranger. For becoming my partner in every sense of the word, for loving me back. Always, Natalie promised, forever and always. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Burning off the morning chill, Preston and Natalie Pike sat together in the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created from courage and kindness and love. They had been promised to other fates, he to a life of restless searching, she to a nightmare marriage with a cruel man. But they had found each other at exactly the right moment, and they had chosen to fight for something better. It was a simple story in many ways. A man saw a woman in trouble and offered help. The woman took a leap of faith and accepted. Together, they faced down threats and built a life. No dragons slain, no kingdoms saved. Just two people choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through all the mundane moments and extraordinary challenges that make up a life. But in its simplicity lay its beauty. Because in the end, that is what love is. A daily choice to show up, to care, to fight for the person beside you. Preston and Natalie had made that choice 30 years ago, and they made it again every single day since. And they would keep making it, for whatever years remained to them, until the very end of their story.